would like to welcome, over here. I would like to welcome everyone to this Thursday, November 17th meeting of the Delta Stewardship Council, being broadcast live from the Sacramento Convention Center, where the Delta Science Conference is fully underway. We will begin with the roll call, beginning with retired federal court judge, council member Frank Demerel, who's here.
Tatayan here.
Fiorini here.
PFO here.
We have a quorum. The next item is to recess to closed executive session. For those of you that are following online, I presume that we will be reconvening sometime between 9:30 and 9:45. So we are recessed to executive session now. Reconvening in open session. There was no action taken in closed session. Welcome to those of you who have joined us in the room and those who are tuned in on the webcast. File item number 6, Chair's report. This week has been the busiest week of my Delta Stewardship Council Chairman's life. You're going to hear more from Jessica Law in a little bit about the results of the most recent Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee meeting that was held on Monday. I had the privilege of presiding over a panel discussion yesterday here at the conference related to the State of Bay Delta Science Report 2016 that you'll be hearing more about today. And now we have our monthly council meeting. So unless the council members have any questions about my activities, which I hope you don't, then
Mr. Chairman, I did have a comment, if you don't mind, on the Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee meeting on Monday, just to compliment you on your stewardship of convening the group, getting all the department heads there, and not just the talking heads, but the knowledgeable heads, the ones making the policy decisions, and the staff that support them in the room and convening the meeting. And as usual, had a robust agenda, very hearty, very meaty. And as you recognize, Jessica Law and her team that designed and implemented the entire meeting very efficiently, very effectively, and the effort doesn't go unnoticed or unrecognized, certainly by me, and I'm certain by my council member colleagues.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the compliment, and thank you for representing the Delta Protection Commission at the table and providing comments and support. It's appreciated. Very good. Let's now move on to file item number 7, Executive Officer's Report. Jessica.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Among the handouts that have been provided to you this morning, you'll find a copy of the last of a 3-part series produced by the San Francisco Estuary Institute called A Delta Renewed, A Guide to Science-Based Ecological Restoration in the Delta. You're among the few to receive a special hard copy, but it's also available online. And you'll recall that Dr. Letitia Grenier from the Estuary Institute discussed this report with us at our September meeting on a panel with staff from Department of Fish and Wildlife. And really it provides insight and recommendations with 2 main messages. Delta restoration success is possible, and that proven examples exist. It's based on a landscape ecology framework, which is intended to be more holistic than an emphasis on species-by-species protection. And this report will feed directly into the conservation framework, which is being developed by the Department of Fish and Wildlife now to guide restoration efforts in the Delta over the next 25 years, and then into our own efforts to amend our ecosystem policies and recommendations in the Delta Plan. So I'm going to keep the rest of my remarks short because the focus today really is on understanding new science, and I want you to have plenty of time to explore the final day of our 2016 Bay Delta Science Conference. Special thanks to all of our hardworking staff who made this both a useful and very well-attended conference, especially Marina Brand, Nir Oxenberg, Kelly Souza, George Isaac, Eric Alvarez, and all of those who led or participated in panels and talks. We've had 1,100 people registered for the three-day event, which is quite impressive and really evidence of the hunger for these types of events and forums. I mentioned to you last month that the West Sacramento Area Flood Control Agency had submitted a consistency determination for its Southport Sacramento River Early Implementation Project. The deadline for appeal to the council passed by on November 4th with no filings. This project will implement flood risk reduction measures along 6 miles of the Sacramento River South Levee in the Southport area of West Sacramento. The project will bring the levee up to standard with federal and state levee design criteria, as well as provide opportunity for ecosystem restoration. The total project encompasses approximately 610 acres. And again, special thanks to our council staff who engaged with the project proponents in a consultative role. We have no legislative update today. However, at this time, I will turn to Bethany Payne for our legal update.
Thank you, Ms. Pearson. Chair Fiorini and members, I am so excited to introduce to you today Mr. Adam Silva, the newest addition to our legal office. A few of you may remember him from his internship here with us a few years ago. He has since graduated from law school, passed the bar, and gotten even more environmental law experience under his belt. And he's here today to give you his first legal update, which I think you'll find interesting today. We had quite a few interesting cases pop up this month.
Welcome, Adam.
Thank you, Chair Fiorini and members of the council. The first case we'll be discussing today is the City of Fresno et al. Versus the United States. This case was filed on October 5th, 2016 in the Court of Federal Claims in Washington, D.C. Judge Mary Ellen Coster-Williams has been assigned to oversee this case. Now, the plaintiffs in this case are the City of Fresno and 17 other water, irrigation, and utility districts. They have filed a takings claim alleging that the Bureau of Reclamation violated the Fifth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution by appropriating the plaintiff's water without just compensation. Now, each plaintiff has a water supply contract to receive water from the facilities of the Friant Division of the Central Valley Project. However, due to the extreme drought during the water year of 2014, the Bureau appropriated all the water from the Friant Division and used it to satisfy other water contracts with a group of users known as the exchange contractors, who had invoked their senior water rights during this time of drought. However, the plaintiffs maintain that there were still sufficient quantities of water in Millerton Lake to satisfy their contracts. And they allege that without water from the Friant Division, that they suffered crop losses, losses of groundwater reserves, water shortages and rationing, and were forced to spend millions of dollars on emergency water supplies. So their suit is asking for the fair market value of the water and the water rights taken, which equates to roughly $350 million. The second case we'll discuss today is Alaska Oil and Gas Association v. Pritzker. This improves our understanding of the concept of the best available sciences. So this was a ruling that came down on October 24th, 2016 by Judges Raymond Fisher, Richard Baez, and Andrew Hurwitz of the United States Court of Appeal for the Ninth Circuit. The court here held that the National Marine Fisheries Services properly listed the Beringia distinct population segment of the Pacific bearded seal as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. The Fisheries Services had determined that the seal, while not currently endangered, would lose its habitat due to climate change by the end of the century. Now, this particular population of seals relies upon non-contiguous sea ice flows over areas of shallow water. And the seals use these ice flows for critical biological functions such as mating, whelping, nursing of pups. The seals use these ice flows to escape land-based predators, and they also use the flows for convenient access to productive areas of ocean floor where the seals prefer to feed. And the Fisheries Services use 6 climate models to determine the impact of climate change on these ice flows, and determined that ice in critical areas would completely disappear by the year 2095. As such, the service published its final listing decision, listing this population as threatened in December of 2012, and the Alaska Oil and Gas Association filed suit shortly thereafter, claiming that the climate models cannot reliably predict the degree of global warming beyond the year 2050. However, the court, in ruling that the agency properly listed these species, noted that the Endangered Species Act requires the reviewing agency, when determining whether or not to list a species, to make its decision solely on the basis of the best scientific and commercial data available. And the court noted that the best scientific data available does not mean the best scientific data possible. And the underlying research information does not need to be ironclad or absolute. And the court noted here that the Fisheries Service provided a reasonable and evidence-based justification for mid-century and end-of-century sea ice projections, and adequately demonstrated a nexus between the loss of sea ice and the risk of the seal's future extinction. So we will continue to monitor these 2 cases and other pertinent cases, and we look forward to our December legal update. Does anybody have any questions?
Questions of Adam? Great, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Adam, and welcome.
Okay, so on today's agenda, next we'll lead into the Dr. Dom's report, where he's going to discuss the highlights of the conference so far, and Jessica Law, our Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee Coordinator, will brief the Council on the outcomes from the Science Enterprise Workshop, as Randy mentioned. Then we'll move into a presentation on Delta Levy Science, and our Delta Independent Science Board member, Dr. Brian Atwater, is going to brief the Council on the ISB's recent Delta Levy Science Workshop and their report, Earthquakes and High Water as Levee Hazards on the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. And then finally, we'll have a presentation on the State of Bay Delta Science Report. Darcy Austin, a program manager at the Council, and State of Bay Delta Science Managing Editor, will provide an overview of the report. It's a collection of 15 papers, as we've mentioned to you before, and as you've seen a presentation on portions of those papers, particularly if you were at the DPIC meeting on Monday. And there's a policymaker's overview that synthesizes the current scientific understanding of the Bay and the Delta, with an emphasis on progress that's been made since it was first published in 2008. 9 of the 15 papers have been published thus far, and the remaining papers are expected in December 2016. And so with that, I conclude my executive officer's report.
Great, Jessica. Any questions of Jessica? I have been advised by a council member and our legal counsel that I failed to address file item number 3. So at this time, I'd like to call your attention to file item number 3, adoption of the October 27th, 2016 meeting summary.
I'll move the item, Mr. Chairman.
PFO moves. Tatayan seconds. Any discussion? Let's begin with the vote.
Tatayan, aye.
Fiorini, aye.
PFO, aye.
Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much. Now on to file item number 8, lead scientist report. Dr. Cliff Dom, who is very busy this week.
Yes, it's been quite a busy week. It's actually been quite a rewarding week, too. Just wanted to say a few things to build upon what Jessica has already told you about, but the 3rd day of the Bay Delta Science Conference is going on today. We hope you avail yourself a little bit of some of the activities that are going on. There are some things I think that were put on this day because they have a science policy theme, or they have actually or invasive species, which is another, I think, issue of interest here. It's the 9th time this has been done. It's a biennial conference. First time was in 2000. We have about 1,100 people here attending the conference. That's really quite remarkable for a regional conference to have that kind of participation from the scientists. We have 28 special sessions that are ongoing. I think probably about 3 or 4 still left to be completed today. There's approximately 250 oral talks and about 150 posters. A few of the posters are actually up in the hallway up here upstairs. The majority of them are downstairs in the area where lunch will be served. It's something that doesn't get done without a lot of time and energy, and I want to basically repeat what Jessica said, and that is the staff of the Delta Stewardship Council have worked extremely hard to make this a successful conference. It's a lot of time and energy, and they do a fantastic job. They really are professional at putting this on, and I've gotten nothing but positive feedback from the people that I've been talking to that are attending. I think they really enjoy the content, the venue. Plenary, I think, was quite interesting, variety of interesting talks, and we're hearing about a variety of different science topics, and for me it's always interesting to go to some of the sessions where we learn about where we've invested dollars in science back in the past and what some of the products that are coming out of this. So this whole concept of getting best available science, these kind of venues, these kind of communication events are certainly one of the important ways that we communicate that science and also help us think about where science might be headed in the future. What are some of our major needs? So I just wanted to say that briefly before I introduce Jessica Law, because this November has not only been the science conference, but it has also been another major science-focused event that Jessica Law of our staff and Mike Chakowski of the U.S. Geological Survey were instrumental in making the Science Enterprise Workshop happen. I think also a really uplifting and positive event, and Jessica, I'd love to have you brief the council on some of the things that happened on October 31st, November 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. So, took a break in between, a week. Now we're doing another one. I think all of us are going to be thankful come Thanksgiving.
All right. Good morning, Chair Fiorini, council members. I'm so happy. Is that better?
Great. Welcome, Jessica.
Good morning. We've been hearing about how busy this month has been, and not only has it been busy, but I think there's a lot of really positive outcomes that are coming from all of these events. So the Science Enterprise Workshop was November 1st and 2nd. We actually started the week out with a boat tour with some of the participants that came out to get them oriented to the Delta. The discussions on November 1st were really focused on a comparison of some of the regional systems. So Chesapeake Bay, Puget Sound, Great Lakes, coastal Louisiana, and the Florida Everglades. And I think we heard a lot of interesting things in those presentations. There are, between the presentations on day 1 and then the panel discussions on day 2, the organizing committee for the workshop and a lot of the DPIC member agencies and staff got together on Thursday, November 3rd to sort of put together a list of what we heard at the workshop. What are the lessons learned and how are they relevant to what we're doing here in the California Bay Delta? So there was a list of about 7 items that came out of the workshop that we thought were really sort of broad lessons learned. Incorporate peer review into scientific processes, work on having a competitive grant process, look at integrated modeling. I won't go through the entire list right now, but we talked about the outcomes from the workshop at the DPIC meeting on this Monday. And the DPIC discussion, I thought, was a really good way of capturing both the outcomes of the workshop and sort of a sense of where we need to go in terms of priorities for next steps. So what we said at the DPIC meeting is that we would tackle first a proposal to put together integrated modeling, linking both physical and biological models for the Delta ecosystem. And I think it's actually been really helpful that we have the conference going on right now because there's a lot of interest. There was a lot of interest after the workshop in this proposal, and there was a lot of interest after the DPIC meeting, and we've had some really good discussions with all of the experts that are here at the conference this week. So that's sort of the number one priority coming out of the workshop that we're going to tackle first. We're also going to be working to do a longer workshop report that will have more detail on the full set of recommendations, those sort of set of 7 items that I talked about. The DPIC committee members were interested in a few of those as sort of early priorities. And we'll continue to work with the Delta Agency Science Work Group to put together sort of more specific proposals and really bring that back to DPIC in April. So just quickly on the DPIC meeting, again, it was Monday, 1 to 5. We talked first about the Science Enterprise Workshop. We had presentations on the state of Bay Delta Science and Delta Renewed, which you're going to be hearing about a lot today. And then the third agenda item that we had was a presentation on the conservation framework and an update on the Eco Restore program. And the biggest outcome from that item was a commitment by the DPIC committee members to review a list of the Eco Restore projects and to come back at the April 2017 DPIC meeting and let us know how their agencies can help to move implementation of those projects. So to do a review of the permitting process. So it was a good discussion overall by the committee members. We had about 50 people in the audience in attendance, and we're looking forward to the next meeting. So any questions?
Jessica,
Feedback?
good overview. I just want to highlight the outcome of the Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee that led to an agreement around the table to pursue a review of the permitting for the next 14 Eco Restore projects that are in the queue and are going to need a lot of cooperation and a lot of effort by a lot of agencies if those are going to be moving along at an efficient pace. The agreement that was achieved, I think, was probably a milestone for the work of that committee, and I'm very grateful for all of the work that you and staff have done in preparing for each of the meetings, in particular the one on Friday that led to a really good outcome, I thought. Any questions of Jessica?
There were so many good people at that Science Enterprise workshop. How'd you get them here, and how do you pay for it?
So how did we get them here? So a lot of the experts that came and did the regional system overviews are USGS scientists. USGS has a structure, how they're structured, they have sort of regional ecosystem program managers. So Mike Chakowski, who's our co-host, is in that similar position here in the Bay Delta. So it was pretty easy to identify those resources around the country. And USGS sponsored all of their scientists that came to the conference. And then the other panelists and experts that we had, we really tried to get a broad cross-section. We tried to have a few attorneys and social scientists and sort of, broader perspectives at the workshop. And the Delta Stewardship Council, Delta Science Program supported the travel and hotel accommodations for those other scientists and experts that came to the conference.
So, Dan Ray probably told me this answer a long time ago when we went to the budget hearings, but is that sort of incorporated in our base budget every year, or does that draw on some special funds?
My understanding is this is part of a contract that we have, a long-term contract with UC Davis to do a variety of special studies and workshops. So it's part of our Delta Science budget, yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you really see the value of it at a conference like that. Thank you.
Thanks.
And we really couldn't pull it off without having a partner like UC Davis that has the expertise in doing something like this quickly, and the partnership of the science that we can bring with just the conference organizing skills that they have works very well.
Right. And we partnered with UC Davis Extension and also the Coastal Science Marine Institute, or CIMSI. Yeah. Any other questions?
Okay.
All right.
Jessica, thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you.
So I have 5 items that I want to share with you briefly, and I will end with by the numbers that Lauren Yamani will present to you. The 4 items that I wanted to share with you are in your briefing book. The first one I was reading last night, and I'll read it here. It says, Low-Intensity Chemical Dosing Seminar, Opportunities to Improve Delta Water Quality, Leveraging Hybrid Coagulation and Wetland Treatment Systems. My reaction when I read that was, boy, that's geek speak, if anything is. So let me pull apart the pieces and try to explain to you what this workshop was really all about. So the first two words I think that are important are low intensity. So this is something that is being done in the field in some of the wetland areas within the Delta to see whether or not they can improve water quality by making additions of some chemicals that are used widely in wastewater treatment to basically take some of the things that are dissolved in the water, put it into a particulate form that can then be filtered out or allowed to settle out of the water. So the low intensity means they're using very low concentrations of these materials. The chemical dosing means that they are adding a chemical to the water. And then hybrid coagulation, these are compounds that then react with things in the water, forming a solid. That's the coagulation phase, which then can be filtered out or precipitated out. And then wetland treatment systems are actually built systems to test how effective these techniques are. So we had a workshop on this. One of our Delta Science Program staff actually worked on this very topic for her doctoral research at UC Davis and was interested in communicating this technology a little more broadly. So she brought in a group of people that spent a day on October the 26th going over the information that have been derived from these experimental protocols, discuss whether it's feasible at a larger scale, and it involves things that are in the water, including nutrients, organic matter that can produce, for example, taste and odor problems, and also mercury and some of the forms of mercury that potentially can get in the food web. So can we use this methodology to reduce the risk to some of the, for example, some of the fish communities in the Delta by using a technique like this to keep the mercury in the sediment and not let the mercury get out into the water. So this was a one-day study. There will be a summary report, I believe, that will be produced as a byproduct. So that just wanted to translate. Hopefully that was clear about what this seminar or what this meeting was about. The paper I've selected to share with you that I found to be of interest in some of my recent readings for this month is a paper by Anthony Leroy Westerling. I had an opportunity to meet Leroy when I visited the University of California at Merced earlier this year to give a seminar. I knew of his work. He's a real leader in addressing the issue of how changing climate in the western United States is affecting our forests, and in particular how it's affecting forest fires and forest fire distribution. He wrote a very, I think, very important paper that was published in 2006 in the journal Science. The title, and in fact, with some co-authors, including Dan Cahan, who I know is here at our conference. The title of it was Warming and Earlier Spring, Increased Western U.S. Forest Wildfire Activity. People have certainly taken note of this. He's now continued to do a lot of the types of analysis on how things are changing. I wished I could report back to you that things are getting better, but they're not. They're getting worse. So we're now spending, in the last few years, we're spending $2 billion a year on forest fire fighting, suppression. 15 years ago, it was $1 billion. So we're seeing a continued ramping up of the costs to fight these kind of fires. This paper, I think, brings a few things home in terms of understanding what's going on out in our western forests. First of all, the wildfire activity is very strongly associated with warming and earlier spring snowmelt. So the melting of the snow earlier in the year is producing the conditions then that allow drying to put these forests at risk. Most of the fires are naturally caused by lightning strikes. And he goes on to analyze then where forests in the western United States are being affected. Right now, the area where there's the most rapid ramping up of forest fire activity is actually in the northern Rockies, but significant increases here in the Sierra Nevada and in the Pacific Northwest also. So paper does a very nice job of going into the details and quantifying things like the acreage burn, the intensity of the burns, how long the fires last. One of the, I think the things that really surprised me is that 3 decades ago, the average fire might have lasted a week. Now the average fire lasts a couple months. So those are some of the kind of things that are highlighted in this paper. So,
Cliff, I just wanted to point out, anybody that's driven from Oakhurst to the entrance to Yosemite National Park could have written could have concluded that there's a big problem, at least in that region of the Sierra Nevada.
yeah.
Reports like this, would this fall under useful or usable science?
I would think it's usable.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, part of the discussion here, I wasn't actually going to discuss it, but I think it's an interesting one, is that how much of this is due to changing climate, which is clearly occurring, the earlier snow melt and the decreased snowpack and the moving higher and higher in elevation as to where they're rainfall dominated rather than snow dominated system. But the other question that he asks in this paper is how much of it is also due to our management protocols that we've used. So we fought fire aggressively for a century. In some areas that has produced a lot of small trees. Those small trees can produce dense thickets, and they can end up being a conduit to moving fire from the ground into the lower canopy into the upper canopy. And so he addresses that. He says that that's more of an issue in the southwestern United States, less so an issue in the Pacific Northwest and in the northern Rockies. So the northern Rockies, he attributes most of this increased fire activity to the longer period of time without snow. And in fact, the areas that are most rapidly changing in terms of their fire frequency are areas that used to be snow-free only 2 to 4 months a year that are now more likely to be snow-free 4 to 6 months a year. So that's where a lot of the increased fire activity is occurring. Okay, the next article that I wanted to highlight is one of our State of Bay Delta science synthesis papers. This is I've been trying to share with these papers with you as they've been published by the San Francisco Estuary and Watershed Science Journal. So I think we covered the first 5 in the first issue that came out, and now we're working on the 3 from the second issue that came out. The paper that I wanted to highlight today is a paper by Larry Brown, Wim Kimmer, Louise Conrad, Sarah Leismeister, and Anke Mueller-Solger. All of them are probably prowling the halls of this building as we speak. I think I've seen all of these 5 authors during the conference. They wrote the paper on food webs of the Delta and Suisun Bay and Suisun Marsh, and they have an update on current understanding and possibilities for management. 2008, State of Bay Delta Science had a chapter on food webs, so this is an update of some of the things that have come to light in the last 8 or 9 years. I wanted to highlight some of the concluding ideas that they finished their paper with. It's a detailed, in-depth look at the food webs in a lot of these different types of habitats, but I think they've done us a nice service in their conclusions by coming out with 8, I think, clear conclusions about where we are and understanding food webs, how they're changing, and also some of the needs to continue to better understand these food webs as we move forward. The first conclusion that they highlight is the fact that our open waters within the Delta, we use the word pelagic, but these open water systems have low productivity and low biomass, and why that is remains an interesting area of research. There is certainly some potential limitation to production because of the light regime. There's a potential of low production because of the high rates of grazing by some of the invasive clams that are in the bottom of these systems, and there's also some possibilities that the types of contaminants and chemicals we put in the delta are having effect on production. And so they highlight these three pathways that may be affecting the low pelagic open water biomass. There was a special session, for example, yesterday that looked at an example where high production has showed back up into the system. We had a series of good productivity blooms of algae, desirable algae, the diatom forms of algae that occurred in the spring and early summer of 2016. And so trying to better understand why this kind of activity occurred, and also with the new instrumentation that's now deployed, really good pictures of where it started, where it moved, the duration, the intensity, and then the dieback at the end of the system. The big unknown question is how much of that increased production is working its way up into, for example, the food web of the fish. And so that's an area of interest and discussion. Second area that they highlight, and it's one that you've heard me highlight, and I'll certainly continue to make this point, is that harmful algal blooms are a fact of life in the Delta now. They've been around for a decade and a half, and we really need to understand what role they're playing, and we need to do something about them. And we, at this point in time, do not have a monitoring program in place to monitor these organisms. There was funding in 2014 and 15, special studies that was actually associated with the drought funding that allowed some interesting data to be collected. There's a series of posters actually downstairs on that very topic. But as far as I know, the drought funding has ended, and routine monitoring and study of these harmful algal blooms is not, at this point in time, being supported. Yep.
Mr. Chairman, if I can comment on that, the algal blooms from a community perspective and in Delta perspective are very alarming. There are a lot of community members and my community, Discovery Bay, and I know certainly in the Stockton area as well, where the flow of the waters get pocketed into bays and inlets, so to speak. What can we as leaders say to the community about the level of risk, the level of concern, what we can do at a local level, how to address it, or how do we, I think even more importantly, continue to advance the topic into the science, into the policy development. Drought conditions certainly don't help and probably enhance the problem. I believe the flows through the Delta, freshwater flows through the Delta, have an impact. To what degree, I think probably should be thoroughly analyzed. Impacts of microcystis, I mean, it's becoming a really big deal, a really, really big deal. And I appreciate, Cliff, you referring to it and you talking about it in your science report, but I'd like to see this body, like we did, Mr. Chairman, the invasive aquatic weeds, look at how we can continue to highlight the issue and work to develop policy around it and become a forum, not just for as being stewards of the Delta, which is our main primary objective, but how do we help communities understand the impact and what they can do to help address it and help the policy and even the advocacy for funding on what to do, even if it's simply studies identifying what the conditions are. There's a lot in there, I know.
I was going to say, there's a lot.
And I haven't had coffee
I was going to
yet.
take a deep breath and say, okay. Well, I concur with what you've just said. I mean, this is a multifaceted problem. It's a public health problem. It's an ecological problem. It is, it probably is an economic problem, actually. So all of these things, I think, need to be addressed. There's no question that conditions that we find in the Delta today, drought being one of them, but warmer temperatures being another, increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which potentially is also helping these same groups of organisms to grow, because they're very good CO2 scavengers out of the atmosphere and superficial water. So there's a whole bunch of important questions. I think there's increasing number of get-togethers now where this is being discussed, but I don't think we've come up with a sustained long-term solution to actually do the monitoring, communicate with the people who are affected, and potentially also look for solutions, see if there's some ways that we can hopefully at least dissipate the problem, if not eliminate the problem.
Isn't, Cliff, excuse me for interrupting, but isn't this also going to be part of the analysis that we're going to be funding as part of the regional sand upgrade and impacts on harmful algal blooms of the ammonium reduction?
Well, I think, as I mentioned in my plenary talk here on Tuesday, the upgrade of the regional sand facility, which is ongoing, it's called, I keep wanting to say eco water, but it's eco water, is going to reduce the nutrient loading, and it's going to change the form from ammonium to nitrate. Microcystis is known to be an ammonium-utilizing cyanobacteria. One of the interesting hypotheses is what will this upgrade do to the distribution, intensity, duration of these Microcystis blooms, and it's one thing that I'm promoting as an area that really needs some scientific attention, and it would be very useful to study this before, during, and after the upgrade, rather than just simply react to it after the upgrade occurs. So I'm trying to promote that and trying to get some people engaged to actually do that.
How's your promotion going?
Lots of people are interested in doing that. The science program has a little bit of resources that will seed some projects in 2017, but ultimately I think we need to build a bigger consortium of people interested in doing this so that it can be both continued through 2025 or time frame 2021 is when the big switchover is going to be occurring, a partial switchover in 2019. So I think it's something that hopefully the council will continue to push us to make this happen. Let's put it that way.
I think the other platform for getting more attention on this issue is the development of our science action agenda and the likelihood that that will rise to the top and then provide us some momentum to help organize both the activity on this front and maybe additional funding.
Good.
Yeah, because there's two other aspects of the upgrade that I think will be very interesting to follow and hopefully will be monitored and studied well, and that is, will this have an effect on any of the invasive aquatic plants that are in the system, either the free-floating ones like water hyacinth or some of the rooted ones like the Brazilian waterweed? Interesting question, one that I think could be addressed by good studies that are designed and started now. And then the third area is there is this question about whether or not the ammonium that's the dominant form of inorganic nitrogen currently in the effluent is having an effect on the production of these desirable algal blooms that are diatom dominated. And again, this is not settled science. People certainly have differing opinions on this, but this is an opportunity to test the idea that changing the form will also change the community structure towards something that would be preferential over what we have now currently in the Delta. So lots of opportunities associated with it. As I think Chair Fiorini has mentioned a couple times, this is a large-scale, ecosystem-scale natural experiment that hopefully we can avail ourselves of. Okay, let's see. I'm only on number 2 of their 8 recommendations, so let me continue. The next one, I think, is modernizing the monitoring program. So lots of monitoring gets done in the Delta, and there's lots of long-term data that's been very important in our understanding of the Delta. But there's also new tools, new technologies that are available, and there are also technologies that can look at the Delta more holistically rather than just at individual points. So that's another thing. And there's also changing structure to the Delta, and including the harmful algal blooms, these submerged aquatic macrophytes that are invasive, these floating forms that are invasive. These are things that this group of authors prioritize very highly as an important need for the science going forward. They also point out that a lot of the restoration projects that are starting up now are focusing on tidal wetland restoration, and we need to come up with a good way to evaluate their effectiveness. So that's another key conclusion that they come to in this paper. Again, another call out to study the vegetation and the associated organisms that live within these aquatic vegetation types, both the free-floating and the submerged. So There are food webs associated with these. A lot of times you hear that they're deleterious to the native species within the delta, but the authors here, I think, say that it's not that clear. We really need to see whether that is true. Connecting the floodplains and the food webs that connect, when we connect the the floodplains like we're doing experimentally now in Yolo Bypass is an area they call out. They also think that modeling tools that basically interface some of the various components of the food web need to be enhanced and improved. And then the final point that they make is we need to give the people that are doing these kind of studies time and resources to synthesize and analyze this so that we have better communication tools to communicate the results from some of these studies. So those are their 8 take-home messages. As Jessica just said, I'm sure that these ideas are going to be part of the emerging 2017 Science Action Agenda, that it's a major undertaking by the science program. So that's some of the key points that came out of this paper, and be happy to answer any questions about that paper, or otherwise I'll move on to the next item.
Any questions? No.
The other thing I wanted to highlight is we have been having a series of seminars, brown bag seminars, that focus on the state of Bay Delta science. You're going to hear more about that effort later on in the council meeting. The most recent of those was a talk by Letitia Grenier from the San Francisco Estuary Institute. She came and talked about the Delta as a changing landscape. She's a co-author on the landscape ecology chapter that's been developed and published now for State of Bay Delta Science. In addition, Letitia is also part of the production of a document that was released on Monday. This is a Delta Renewed, a guide to science-based ecological restoration in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. So on Monday, we had actually 2 major rollouts of new studies. The first one is the Delta on Fast Forward, Thinking Beyond the Next Crisis, which you're going to hear about later on in the council meeting, and the Delta Renewed, which I've got a hard copy. I think they're kind of precious, but they are. It's available online. A lot of really interesting, large-scale looks at the Delta and thinking about what future scenarios might mean for different aspects of a future Delta, with a time frame, looking decades ahead rather than short term. So I think I have covered the items that I was intending to cover, except for by the numbers. I'd be happy to take questions now, or otherwise we can invite Lauren Yamani up to give you some information on some of the current climate and hydrology conditions.
Cliff, I think the council's eager to get out to the conference and take in some of the presentations. Thank you very much for that.
Lauren.
All right. Good morning, Chair Fiorini and council members.
Good morning, Lauren.
Good morning. So this is the second report of By the Numbers since the start of the new water year. The Northern Sierra gained an additional 5.5 inches of precipitation, and we are still quite a bit above average for that region at 207% of that region's average to date. Cumulative precipitation in the Central Sierra also increased, this time by 2.2 inches, and that puts that region at 147% of its average to date. These percentages were greater by 95% for the Northern Sierra and 59% for the Central Sierra in last month's report, which just gives you an idea of how much rain came out of that late October storm. Moving on to water supply, average storage at Shasta Reservoir is up by 6% of its average to date, pushing it above 100%. Oroville storage dropped by just 1% from last month, and San Luis Reservoir increased 14% from last month's average, so it's now at 64%. Both Oroville and San Luis Reservoirs continue to garner poor ratings. flow at the Sacramento River at Freeport has increased by 9% of the 20-year monthly average, where salinity continues to be good at the site. Fortunately, flow for San Joaquin at Vernalis has increased by almost 50% of its average to date from last month. However, salinity has increased 528 electrical conductivity units, so it's now at 710 on that scale, or if you were to make the conversion, approximately 426 parts per million for total dissolved solids. So flow at the Central Valley and State Water Project diversion sites has increased in rating to good after having increased by 30% of its average to date, while salinity continues to be fair at the pumps. So we finally have some fish numbers for you this month. So starting off with Winter Run Chinook, the estimate of escapement, which is basically the number of fish that escape harvest in the fishery to spawn, is set at 1,545 fish. It's important to note that this is not the final estimate, but is considered the final draft number, and could potentially be subject to change. This value of escapement is considered to be poor at just 53% compared to the 13-year average, but it is a little higher than last year's estimate of 1,191. Okay, so the Delta Smelt Fall Midwater Trawl, it's the third seasonal survey for the Delta Smelt and captures the number of adults right before they spawn. So this follows the 20 millimeter survey for the post-larvae and the summer tonet survey for juveniles. And just recall that the smelt life cycle is a year long. So the fall midwater trawl runs from September through December, and monthly indices of abundance are calculated for each month. The indices are then summed to get an overall index value, which is the population estimate, but that estimate won't be ready until January. So the index so far is 0. That's because September and October indices were both 0. At this point in the year, the fall midwater trawl index is on average 253, just to give you some perspective. However, the Delta Smelt index appears to be potentially moving in the right direction. So it's rumored that the fall midwater trawl index for November is likely to be around 7. So we still have reason to be hopeful. The fall midwater trawl index last year was also 7, and that suggests that the fall midwater trawl index will likely at least not be worse than last year's. So that concludes by the numbers. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren.
That concludes our report.
Thank you. All right. Any requests for public comment? Then that concludes file item number 8. On to file item number 9. Jessica, presentation levee science hazards workshop paper.
Okay, with that, I'll invite up Dr. Brian Atwater.
Dr. Brian Atwater, member of the Delta Independent Science Board. Welcome. Help is on the way.
Thank you. Well, this is not a numbers report, but it's from 1906 in July from the San Francisco Call. The front page, just for comic relief, has a headline, Plain Stew instead of diamonds, girl who swallowed a gem must subsist on prison food, given a 5-year term. But inside is a more sobering headline about the San Joaquin River still rising. Hot spell sends stream up to point alarming to the farmers. Force of men on guard night and day to prevent break in levees. In some ways, this little newspaper item captures some of the themes of the workshop that was held in July at UC Davis on hazards to levees posed by floods and by earthquakes. Certainly in the flood category, the main conclusion offered to the board by the experts who assembled, I think, was that in the near term, a confluence of elevated sea levels elevated not by long-term effects of warming of oceans and return of ice water to the oceans, but instead by the effects of El Niños and storms piling up ocean water against this coast. As happened in 1983, that the confluence of that with storms and waves that give you this combination of high discharge, high sea levels, that those things are the big near-term threat to delta levees. But at the same time, there, as Dan Cahan in an update here, he also spoke with us in July. An update yesterday gave a somewhat pessimistic view of sea levels by the end of this century being even higher than, projected to be even higher than was previously thought. On the earthquake side of things, it's a little the opposite, that those gathered at this workshop, the seismologists are scratching their heads as to whether the earthquake hazard in the Delta is as great as it had been thought previously. So those are the main takeaway messages, I think, that the board, the Independent Science Board, none of us specialists in these fields, took away from the gathering. So I hope that your briefing materials would include a document like this that gives the program for the workshop. And the second thing it would contain is a black and white workshop report that's somewhat it's not in the florid style of the San Francisco Call of 1906, but it's meant to be a journalistic account of what happened at that workshop and what the people gathered there recommended in the way of research efforts that could give what was the term we just learned. It's very good, the difference between best available science and best possible science. So some possible science that could be done to clarify matters for the Delta. Maybe we should, I don't know if I've given you enough information for discussion, but I fear rambling on. Is there do you wish to start with that, or should I try to fill you in a little more on the workshop?
Thank you, Dr. Atwater. I'm curious. I read the materials given to us, and I'm wondering, with this state of knowledge, what would you recommend to the Delta Levy Investment Strategy team? Are there any sets of levees that stand out as particularly vulnerable either to the storm events that you described or the earthquakes?
I think the recommendation would not, the board would not, I think, venture to offer that kind of recommendation. That's a bit beyond us, I think. And what you got from the workshop are recommendations as to the kinds of work that could be done to improve a Delta levies investment strategy in terms of informing it. And the examples that we gave that are just routine in the earthquake world and now in the climate world as well are periodic reassessments. So we have in this country national seismic hazard, national earthquake hazard maps. And they are produced to serve engineers who must come up with designs that resist earthquakes. And it's recognized that the knowledge is not static, and so every 6 years these things are updated. And there's a whole process nationwide where information is gathered. So there was, for California, something called the Uniform California Earthquake Rupture Forecast, I think, was in 2013 released, and this was a much more comprehensive attempt than previously done to understand the earthquake hazards. And this will, again, by 2019, that kind of revision will be underway. So I think the recommendations that the board might offer would be to stay attuned, keep abreast of these sorts of updates. And the same in the climate world, where Dan Cahan yesterday was talking about revisions of expectations of sea level rise in response to a paper published in 2016 about how Antarctic ice can be more easily wasted away by a combination of warm ocean water coming underneath and ice cliffs falling down. And so these are the kinds of things that I think in the levee world, one would just want to stay abreast of those developments.
Just a clarification, I didn't mean that we were looking for recommendations, but I think if the science indicated to us which sets of levees are most vulnerable or a scale, it would inform any recommendations
right.
that actually our staff would come up with.
Okay, well, thank you for pushing the point. Then we could look at one of the proposals put before this group that gathered in Davis by a seismologist who pointed to an earthquake in the Napa area in 2014, and the measurements of how hard the ground shook at various places distant from the source of that earthquake. And the conclusion from that assessment was that that if you were to have today say a magnitude 6.5 earthquake on the Hayward Fault down near Oakland, that Bethel Island would enjoy a certain amount of shaking from that, right? And that level of shaking would be somewhere between 2 and 4 times weaker than has been predicted by the equations that people have been using to estimate ground motions far from an earthquake source. And so the problem with that hypothesis is that there's not a lot of additional data to go on to see how robust that Napa result is. And this led to a recommendation that maybe you all can act on by seismologists at the gathering, a facetious one, where they said it would be really good to have that 6.5 on the Hayward Fault so that we could get the measurements in the delta to find out whether this so-called attenuation is really, they didn't mean it that way, but that this was, this is the kind of information, and then they're using that point to say it's important to have the delta well instrumented to record these things, because the probability of moderate or large Bay Area earthquakes is high enough that you're likely to capture these and improve the understanding, and then come to the point that you're after of okay, what sorts of investments really need to be made in the West Delta Islands as the ones that are closest to those Bay Area earthquake sources.
Mary?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dr. Atwater, and to the ISB for the report. There's a lot of valuable information, I think, in here, no matter what your perspective is on delta levees and the risk they present. Mr. Chairman, and to Dr. Atwater, how do we dig down into, and you just recommended to Councilmember Tatayan, further action? I mean, what can this council do to further the lack of information or additional studies that are needed? Because there is, reading through the report, which is very thorough, there is some disparate information available, and if we really want true conclusive conclusions, we need more information. And how do we gather that information? Is that a function in a role of this body? Because obviously we have an interest in delta levies. It's clearly obvious by the work that we're doing. So how do we help you? And Mr. Chairman, I'd like some additional clarification of that. But I mean, for instance, there's a reference on page 3, on the necessity to reappraise attenuations in reference to the Dreams report. So how do we bring that together? Existing data indicates that there's a tension that often arises between scientific research and its practical application. The workshop included reminders that delta levies have received hundreds of millions of dollars spent for maintenance and upgrades in recent decades. This engineering work is slated to continue, and it's unlikely to await solution to research problems, meaning a lot of good work is going on today. What if that stopped? For instance, the levy subvention program, which there was a legislative effort to remove the sunset from it in the state legislature this year, and it was continued for 1 year, and it's uncertain moving forward. But from policymakers, how do we take the success, my words, not yours, of the investment in maintenance and upgrades in recent decades that have improved levee conditions, and yet the risk that some of this funding may go away? How do we manage that? Or do you have any insight into managing that?
Let's see. I guess the role of the Science Board would be to point to the opportunities to improve the understanding. So in the case that you mentioned of the so-called attenuation relations, those are those equations that an engineering seismologist would use to say how hard should it shake at Discovery Bay or at Bethel Island in case of a Hayward Fault earthquake of a certain size. And so I think from those, for that particular example, you'd have seismologists who are at that meeting who would be eager to see support for deployment of the instruments that would measure the ground shaking in the delta on various kinds of substrate. What they do is they deploy an instrument in the nearby hills on rock, and then they also deploy instruments on peat and on levee tops, and they ask, how different is the shaking one to another, and that gives useful observational evidence. So those are the kinds of studies that were recommended to us, and we, as journalists, report. I think lay out fairly thoroughly what we learned from those participants as to what they saw was important.
Very thoroughly, and I guess my question is, again, to quote the report, it was proposed that more accelerometers, did I get that right, be deployed to measure delta ground motions before the next moderate or large earthquake on a Bay Area fault. So who does this and when? Is that USGS? And what role does this council have? And again, I don't know if that's something for you, Dr. Atwater, to answer, but something I'd like answered today. How do we move something like that forward? Because frankly, we're all looking for that data. We're all looking for that scientific data. How do we move it forward so we're actually able to see an outcome of the need? Right.
So you speak first to a broader issue that was, in a way, raised by the conference, by this workshop, rather. It was that some of the people who gathered there, though they're working on closely related matters, had not met one another before. And it's much credit to the Delta Science Program staff, in particular to Kelly Souza, who worked extra hard to make this unusual gathering of the Independent Science Board possible. And we structured it in a way where our recommendations, our report, could be useless, and still the participants themselves would get something out of it. We wanted that safety, that the participants who took the time as volunteers to come to this, that they really walked away something useful. And so what you saw in that room was the walls papered with posters, and the structure of the meeting, it was more informal sidebar discussions than it was set piece presentations. So that's a kind of effort that can be supported. And okay, so the Delta, the conference, the Bay Delta Science Conference, doesn't have a strong tradition of bringing those kinds of people together, and maybe that can never happen. Maybe they're just a different community, scientific community, and they're not going to gather here for this I think they should, you know, but that's. And as to who does the work, so this is another reason that this is in a newspaper reporter's style here. This report is that I have a conflict of interest. I work for the United States, or I retired on October 1st, but I worked for USGS. I'm based up in Seattle, and I don't have Delta research interests since I left this area in 1980, essentially. But still, I'm wary of offering recommendations in here that would favor the agency that I work for.
Well, and that's fair. I mean, we should be mindful of neutrality, and it's one thing we rely on, we rely on the science, because it's supposed to be unbiased. I found it interesting, and you made comment to it about the average slip rates on the southern Midland Fault are less certain and are tens of hundreds of times slower than originally expected. And by comparison, slip rates along the San Andreas and the Bay Area are about 20 millimeters a year compared to 0.03 to 0.13 of the southern Midland Fault. So much less than the San Andreas, and maybe much less than people want to believe or posture within the Delta. Well, my editorial.
We tried it. No, I mean we asked for plain English translation of those numbers. I find it hard to think about a fault having an average slip rate of 0.03 of a millimeter a year. With the San Andreas, I think the analogy is made with how fast your fingernails grow or something like that, and that the average slip rate on the San Andreas, I suppose if you let your fingernails grow for a year, you might get an inch out of it. Well, that would be about the San Andreas rate. But the point is that the faster the fault, the faster in the long term that the fault is moving, if the fault is usually stuck together and the slip takes place in earthquakes, then the more often the earthquakes happen, right? So we asked the lead investigator of the Southern Midland Fault, Jeff Unruh, how often he would get a magnitude 6 or magnitude 7 earthquake out of the Southern Midland Fault. And he said, well, maybe 5,000 or 10,000 years apart. So these are very, very low probability events by his current reckoning. But he hastened to point out that this is a very uncertain kind of estimate. The fault is buried, and it's been imaged only by the mostly proprietary oil industry or natural gas industry soundings that look at reflected layers underneath.
Wonder, how do we cross maybe this is too big a question for this forum, but how do we cross that bridge of proprietary information and public value and benefit? It's an interesting one, but the recommendation there, the degree to which I injected recommendations in here that are mine, I put it. It's I'm a geologist who reads earthquake and tsunami history in other places, and I thought that they could do better with the Southern Midland than they had, or at least try some additional things. So I put in here 2 recommendations as to paths forward that could be taken to get a better sense of recent displacement, if any, on the Southern Midland. We'll see whether they get that. In page 6 and 7, and Mr. Chairman, I'm almost completed here. The question is, how has human intervention affected the rates of levee failure in the Delta? And the interventions include dams used in part for flood control and recent investments in levee maintenance and upgrades, which I was touching on earlier. A decade ago, levee failures were described as continuing at a rate undiminished by investments in levee maintenance and upgrades. This finding has been contested, and I think that's an important point of this report that I wanted to highlight, because it is based on failure rates in the Delta as a whole rather than on failure rates from high water at the PD Islands specifically. I will add the word specifically, and tracks where most of the recent levee work has taken place. So we don't have a clear picture.
Right. Well,
I think in some ways we think we do, and some policy people want to believe we have one, but in reality we really don't.
I think it was recognized by participants at this workshop, and we put this recommendation in here, that a shared understanding of Delta levee failure history made it quite publicly available. Maybe this would be something that the Delta Levee Investment Strategy itself could have on their web portal. Would be worth doing. And there are graphs. I think it's on page 19 of your 19 of your handout. There's some rather busy graphs that have levee failures by 3 different ways of reckoning them at the bottom of the graph, and a number of potential contributors to levee failures plotted above it. There's a better version of this that may have gotten to you with a better explanation. But anyways,
it's on our it's at our table.
Yeah, I didn't label things as clearly as I should have. But anyways, that would be something else that could be done. Yes.
And Mr. Chairman, I would suggest that the Stewardship Council, include as much of this as we can in that effort. And also consider, under the Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee, the DPIC, that it may consider being a convener of refer to them as seismic enthusiasts, because I can't think of any other way to describe the geological hazard interest, and how to get the people in the room and at the table at the same time, because it's been proven successful, Mr. Chairman, your efforts with the DPIC about getting everybody in the room at the table at the same time and disseminating the information, networking, collaborating, and sharing data. We're mostly government agencies. As taxpayer dollars, we should be sharing that data and using it more efficiently, wisely, and effectively. The DPIC and the Stewardship Council, I see a role in, and I think the DPIC may have a stronger role. Thank you.
Okay.
And thank you, Dr. Atwater, and to the ISP.
Thank you.
Others? I would highlight that one of the chapters in the State of Bay Delta Science that is due to be released in December addresses not only seismic but high water and subsidence. We had a preliminary discussion yesterday between one of the authors, Steve Deverell, and of that report, and a policymaker to have a conversation about usable science and policymaker needs. The policymaker was Dustin Jones, our own Delta Stewardship Council, Delta Levee Investment Strategy expert. When I asked Dustin, as a decision maker, what more do you need from science? And his response was less uncertainty. And that seems to be a real difficult goal for these matters, because there is so much uncertainty. I think you asked who is going to do this. Ultimately, our levee investment strategy is going to identify structural and non-structural approaches, and some of those non-structural approaches may deem necessary to expand the science look at some of these uncertainties. But thank you for bringing up 1906. That was.
And I might, if I can, I'm going to plug yet again our science action agenda, which is a key way that we implement our Delta Science Plan. Why do we do it? Is it just a wish list? But it's for this very reason. I mean, these issues come up on every matter that comes before the council of unmet research needs, critical research needs, and all of them are important to someone. And so actually taking the effort to put them together, in one place, and then going through a review of relative priority, and then using that as a tool to advocate around the DPIC table for funding, for momentum on those matters. I mean, it's an important part of what we do. And it's why we do the Science Action Agenda.
Other questions for Brian? Yes, Susan?
I don't have a question, but I really like Councilmember Pifo's idea and would add to that idea of convening either through DPIC or another body a group of scientists to help us grapple with the uncertainty question and the information needs. I would add to that, if we could structure a set of questions before convening that body that would help the scientists know what we're trying to do in terms of policy and what our objectives are, I think it would help inform what the scientists bring to the table. So, for example, on the question of uncertainty and this idea that there's reduced motion in this particular fault, I don't know what to do with that information. So from a policymaker standpoint, I would want to be able to move forward and hear from the scientists, is there a level of uncertainty that's acceptable such that we could still take action and describe in a plan to manage the delta for the next 50 years a pathway of improving public safety and ecosystem health and water supply reliabilities. So I'm really excited by the idea. I would just need some experts to help us structure the relevant questions.
Yeah, I think you might turn to the science board and ask them to convene another levy gathering and participate in it that way. Or let's see, another possibility would be, as the next generation of the Uniform California Earthquake Research Rupture Forecast, the one for the 2020 update to the National Seismic Hazard Maps, as that deadline approaches, scientists will be gathering to debate these things. And it could be possible to do a Central Valley kind of focus for one of these gatherings and involve the Stewardship Council in some way as a participant.
It sounds like a good suggestion. Can you help us to
Sure.
Respond to that?
Gladly.
Great.
Randy, on that?
Yes, Patrick.
Thanks. Helpful discussion and information. As policymakers, we and others really have to have a different frame for the risk from flooding as a result of rising waters from various sources, and the risk of earthquake, because earthquakes are so infrequent, the ability to study is limited, growing, but in part dependent upon the occurrence of earthquakes from which you study. So incrementally, when there was earthquake in Long Beach in the 1930s, the Field Act was passed by the legislature to have standards for buildings for public schools that exceed building standards for anything else. So we have charter schools so parents can opt out of Field Act schools and go somewhere else, and presumably there's no danger because the parents have now opted out of it. So our policies are to respond to earthquake events and then try and make things better or safer, right? And even if it took 25 years to rebuild the Bay Bridge. In addition to some continuing study, though, aren't our efforts better focused on framing the risk to water rising? Because that's inevitable and measurable all the time. So the effect of your presentation led me to feel we should regard seismic risk in a secondary category.
Interesting Yeah, conclusion. I tried to frame it as seismologists are scratching their heads, not as seismologists have reached a firm conclusion that the seismic risk has been
But in
previously
10,000 years, you
overestimated.
might reach a firm conclusion.
Yeah. No, in terms of the time scale of these, Mike Dettinger behind me will speak better on this, but you can look at the graph of levee failures in this report and see I've plotted some particularly big El Niños that happen to coincide with levee failures and very high waters, in the Delta. And that's not the only reason you have very high water. The biggest time of levee failures in Delta history appears to be 1907, during a time that doesn't coincide with El Niños. It's just a big Sacramento River flood. But still, these events look also to be decadal or the really big ones, and maybe on the time scale of recurrence of moderate or large Bay Area earthquakes. So it may be, in fact, that they're more nearly, in terms of evaluating them, or just in terms of the frequency occurrence, that they may be more comparable than we're thinking. That doesn't quite address your concern. I'm not sure what more to offer.
No, it's really a reflection that it leads me to think, well, not everything is the highest priority, and actually seismic risk is not as high a priority. That's my working conclusion.
I think, starting with our San Francisco Call article from 1906, the levees. You don't have San Francisco Call articles. Maybe they had no publication after the earthquake. I don't know, but they're telling you that Delta levees failed from the earthquake itself because there are no reports of that, right? And yet it's this big San Joaquin River flood with a snowpack that we're probably not going to easily attain with present-day climate, let alone with the control of discharge, right, from the dams. And so it's a little different situation than 1906 for all this. It's a little hard to. It's not quite a good analog.
Okay. Anything else?
For me, no, except to thank you all for hearing us out.
Dr. Atwater, thank you very much. Interesting report. I believe we have a request for public comment. Thank you. Ben. Tom Zuckerman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Do I have to do anything to this, or is it working?
You're
working?
live.
Okay.
Yeah.
I wanted to start with a thank you for, at long last, it's kind of one of those backward kind of compliments, of having people from the council attend the Delta Levees and Habitat Advisory Committee meeting, last one, and we've been seeking that kind of interchange between the practitioners, if you will, from the state government and the local districts and so forth, and your efforts for some time. And it happened at the last meeting, and those who were there, I think, would agree that it was a very useful exchange and a very realistic one. And I hope that pattern continues, because you have assembled on a monthly basis the most knowledgeable people about the practical aspects of what's going on in the Delta, and it's a very convenient way to have this coalescence that you were talking about with the scientists here on a regular basis. It's very helpful.
Tom, thank you for the compliment, and thank you for the encouragement that you've provided that has caused that to happen.
You're welcome. I attended the Davis thing, and I thought that was most interesting and most informative as well. And the conclusions about the attenuation of earthquake forces from the faults was very interesting. It tended to confirm what we've long thought to be the case is that most of the earthquake fragility, if there is any, in the Delta is going to be in the western fringes of it because of the proximity to the known active earthquake faults and just historical empirical experience that when we have these fairly major earthquakes, their influence doesn't seem to extend very far into the Delta, which was contrary to the conclusions that the Dreams report and some others had reached prior to that time. So I think Mr. Johnson is on the right track here. I think what we can't forget about earthquakes, but I think we can compartmentalize them a little bit better than some of the political statements that are saying, well, we're going to have this huge event, 20 levees are going to fall down and so forth. I think we're putting that kind of argument to the test at this point and can reduce that down to size that's reasonable. The thing that going back to the practitioner's side of this thing and to the question about prioritization, which of course is what you're tasked to do at this level. And I've stated this before, but maybe I'm getting a little bit better at making it clearer. The practitioners feel that the way to approach this is on a base level of protection in the Delta, that there's some level of protection that can be achieved fairly easily now because of all the work that we've done. It's described in a state bulletin that we've all been working towards for years, and we need to complete that work. But that is not to say that we do not recognize that there are assets within the Delta that are more important, that require greater protection, less degree of risk of failure than others, and trying to figure out ways to build upon that base level of protection to protect the export water supply or the highways or the pipelines or whatever the case might be, the population centers is the real task of prioritization. Not all the money from all sources should go into protecting one thing, but these layers of protection that are more easily achievable. And it's going to take us a few years to do it, and we're obviously going to have to identify additional sources of money to complete that work. But we've been doing this for 15, 20 years now. The results are noticeable. The fact that we've had no levee failures for the last 20 years from high water. We're doing something right, and we need to continue that and improve upon it. And I think if we continue this dialogue between the practitioners and the scientists and the policymakers and the scientists and the practitioners, eventually we'll reach a conclusion that will look like that and will be popular and the sort of thing that will go out and pass petitions and get more bond issues on the ballot and get them passed. Thank you very much.
I like your optimism. Thank you. Okay, I think that concludes file item number 9. Thank you all very much for that. The last report item, file item 10, State of the Bay Delta Science Report. Jessica?
Sure. I'd like to welcome up to the table Darcy Austin, and it looks like Mike Dettinger and Dr. Michael Healy. Thank you.
I have seen more of these two mics in the last 3 days than I have seen in the last 2 years. So, gentlemen, welcome.
Strategy.
Share a mic with you. Thank you, and good morning to the council and Chair Fiorini. And this has definitely been a big week for us. I have to say we got our printed copies of the policy for summary makers. We got those on Friday. And then this week we started out with DPIC. We had a reception right after DPIC celebrating sort of completion of State of Bay Delta Science 2016. We've already heard there was a panel yesterday. It was very well attended. Michael Healy participated as one of our scientists, and then Chair Fiorini did an excellent job moderating the discussion. So that was great. And then today I was saying maybe this is the exclamation point for State of Delta Science this week with this council meeting. Okay, so slides. Okay. So we've had quite a bit of introduction already, so I just wanted to mention here that State of Bay Delta Science is part of the Delta Science strategy, and I'm going to come back to this in closing a little bit. So for now, I'll just say that knowledge gaps identified in State of Bay Delta Science 2016 will feed into the Science Action Agenda for 2017, and then progress on actions that were identified in the Science Action Agenda will be included in future updates of State of Bay Delta Science. So there's a feedback loop here that was intended, very intentional. I think I'm missing a slide. Well, I'll go on to this. So this is just our first volume, and I'll flip through these. All of these chapters are listed at the end of the summary for policymakers, which you should have in front of you. So I'll flip through these. We've already mentioned the first volume was published in July, the second volume in October, and the third will be in December. All of these scientific papers were published in the San Francisco Estuary and Watershed Science online journal, and we have a big debt for them and their work that they did. They have a very professional team and helped us get through this process. At the very bottom of that, it's hard to see, but we have the summary for policymakers, which these two members of the editorial board will talk about. And then this was the slide I was looking for. This is really, this was a big effort, and this is a thank you to our authors, but there's a lot of thanks to go around. It was a significant undertaking. It took 3 years. We had 2 Delta lead scientists, and I joked at the DPIC meeting that if you count Michael Healy, there were 3. We had 2 managing editors, so a big thank you goes out to Maggie Chrisman, who helped get this past the goal line. Again, San Francisco Estuary and Watershed Science, we couldn't have done it without them. We had multiple council staff helping us with our maps and also with helping with us, the scientists, to translate some of the science for policymakers. So we didn't say Potamacorbula, we said overbite clam. So, although microcystis still made it into the summary for policymakers. And then, of course, we had a number of contracts. So we had all sorts of staff at the council working on this. And then, of course, our authors, we did have over 50, Mike Dettinger reminded me the other day. And a really big thank you, which I did not mention on Monday at DPIC, and it's an opportunity missed because Mark Sogi was there, but the USGS Pacific region helped fund State of Bay Delta Science. All the USGS authors received funding through them. So thank you to Mark and Jane Reed, Jeff Kay, who's now retired, and Mike Jakowski. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to the editorial board. Is it you? Okay.
Did you want to start us out?
You go ahead. You need to turn your mic on.
So, Mike Dettinger. So in the synthesis, we cover the 3 topics that are listed above. Basically, as we started this out, we were building upon a State of Bay Delta Science report from 2008. As it happened, we didn't actually design it this way, but we fell into it that the same editorial board was working on 2008 and on 2016. And so it was sort of getting the band back together to put this together. But one of the major topics that we had, that we were asked to really address was to, in the context of the science agenda process and the like, was really to focus where we could on what we've learned since 2008. As Darcy said, we're talking about 15 chapters, and my guess, having from what I've seen, Ultimately, it's probably somewhat over 500 pages worth of work that our 50 authors churned out. And as we try and figure out, well, basically, I should say off the top, we've learned a lot since 2008, and those 500 pages or so are really indicative of that. One of the characteristic changes, or one of the changes in characteristics of these things, is that the State of Bay Delta Science Report in 2008 was somewhat more directed towards policymakers, towards the public. This time around, we felt, at least in part because of the science, our role in the science agenda, that we needed to dive deep and and our audience is somewhat more, for the chapters, the individual chapters, it's much more for the scientists involved and the like. One of the things that's done is to really focus. I think the biggest difference between the 2008 SBDS and in particular the perspectives, the summary for policymakers that we extracted from that, was that the topics, the perspectives were generally pretty broad. By the way, there's a list of them on page 4 of the glossy document of the 2008 perspectives. This time around, many similar themes appear, but in virtually every case, probably in every case, there's been a real focusing and honing, which is a natural thing, I think, in the maturation of the science between then and now, but also reflecting the different audiences involved. In any event, just to push on, we've got on the slide there are seven of these major perspectives that we drew from the 2016 SBDS. These are topics that, for the most part, are cross-cutting among more than one chapter. That's sort of what we're going for here. Each of the chapters has its own detailed findings and usually detailed ideas for moving forward or for policy implications. But what I'm going to mention here are these cross-cutting topics. And as you can see up there, the first of these is that, well, in the past, nutrients were considered to be sort of a less important, secondary issue in the Delta. But over the years since, in recent decade, we've increasingly understood that as the sediments and the like, sediment loads, the amount of sediment being carried in the waters of the Delta and the like, have declined, and for other reasons, the waters have gotten clearer, and that means that it's really kind of elevated the importance of nutrients. Light isn't so much a limiting factor, and then you throw in, anyway, nutrients we are recognizing are much more important than perhaps we thought a while back. We find we're realizing now that nutrients play key roles in things like in several important processes like the inhibition of phytoplankton growth, which is not a good thing. That's the food at the base of the food webs. So inhibition of that as opposed to, but it also, nutrient variations and the like end up influencing the, they set the stage for blooms of microcystis, and they play a role with the aquatic vegetation, basically expansions and that sort of thing. And so one of the key findings, as indicated here, is that nutrients really are playing a bigger role than perhaps we were attending to in the past. At the same time, second item up there is that Delta waters contain a complex cocktail of contaminants. This is not news. Back in 2000, as CalFed was being set up, it was recognized that the role and the diversity of contaminants in the Delta was a key and a really critical uncertainty about what was going on in the Delta. By 2008, we were really kind of pointing at the same thing and continuing to say that. I think it's still the case that is still the case, but Michael will talk a bit about some of the new opportunities, some new technological opportunities and the like. But I'll also just note that in terms of this sort of focusing, a lot of the past attention was on lethal doses, on trying to understand lethal effects of contaminants. More recently, the way the science has gone is that we're recognizing that sublethal doses of contaminants that don't kill you play probably as big a role, or at least they're very important in the Delta, in Delta ecosystems, as well as the word cocktail in that finding. Basically, we're really realizing and focusing more on the fact that these contaminants interact, and you can't pick them apart and talk about their individual effects. They have cumulative and interacting effects. Third one is that the aquatic food webs no longer sustain native species. Dr. Dom talked about that in his report on the food webs chapter, and I would just note that basically we're looking there at at least a couple of major regime shifts, we call them, but kind of game-changing moments in the Delta. One of which is an extended one where we've been engineering the Delta from a great inland sea of marshlands and marsh vegetation to this channelized channels separating or bounding agricultural lands that it is today, and that's had major impacts on the food webs. The other one more recently is the arrival of the overbite clams and the like that have changed the story in many ways. But that tendency to attending to these kind of major regime shifts, and specifically the change in the food web, is something that is much more in the state of Bay Delta science now and on our minds now than it was 10 years ago. Species declines are a result of multiple stressors, and this is something that I think that we've known all along, but frankly, if you look back historically, there were times when we thought that if we could just get the exports quite right, or this quite right, that there was a silver bullet or something out there. And clearly the years have taught us that really it's a very complex and interconnected system. In the interest of time, I'm not going to say much more about that. The fifth broad theme is that water management in the Delta, we have increasingly recognized over the past decade will be driven more by extreme events. We tended 10 years ago to be focused on gradual changes. In particular, climate change pops to mind, that we were looking at sort of long-term changes, but certainly the experience in recent years and the advancement of the science, we're now able to look at extreme events, floods, droughts, heat waves, and the like in the climate change projections, as well as other kinds of extreme events like losses of major levees and the arrival of invasive species and the like. We're now in a position to think about those, and we realize that really that's where the rubber hits the road, and so that's a shift from the way we were thinking about climate change, and in many ways change in the Delta 10 years ago. The field of landscape ecology is one that kind of emerged. We have a whole chapter on it in the State of Bay Delta Science Report this time, but I think it's an underlying current in many of the chapters. As we learn more about the system as time goes on, one of the things that always pops out, some uncertainties get smaller, but new uncertainties emerge. That's sort of like death and taxes in terms of inevitability. I think the other inevitability is that the more we learn, the more we realize that everything is connected in the Delta. Landscape ecology is a field of a scientific field that really allows us and teaches us to think about those connections. And I would just note that work that's been done, especially I'll just point at the San Francisco Estuary Institute, their work that Mr. Fiorini mentioned earlier, such as the Delta Renewed. Those sorts of things are really constitute ways of taking what is sort of general in many cases in the field of landscape ecology and really trying to push it to be very actionable, pulling out specific questions that policymakers and scientists should be asking about these things, about restoration and other aspects. And then finally, I just note that the final one there, the situation for native species is dire. The years haven't been kind to that. We've known that for a while, but certainly in the last few years with the drought and the like, we've heard very strong statements from the like of Peter Moyle and others that the situation is extremely dire. That ended up leading us in our perspectives to kind of look around to see what options are really available in the face of frankly, extinction and the like. And Michael will talk a bit about some of those options. But I would just note that one of the findings, I suppose, is that the science isn't there yet to allow informed decisions on a lot of the options, the really kind of extreme options that we're likely to be facing in the future. I'd just like to wrap up by saying the one thing to understand about the SPDS 2008 and 2016 is, as I started out saying, they're really in many ways different creatures, and I would just that has one real basic implication, and that is don't throw away the 2008 SPDS. We're building on it with this one, and you probably are going to want to have both of them around. So, thank you.
Dr. Healy?
Yes, well, thanks, Mr. Fiorini, and thanks for giving us this opportunity to come and speak to the Council. I'm going to move on to talk about new tools for science, but maybe quickly before I do that, some of the water cooler comment I heard after our DPIC presentation was that, gee, it was a really gloomy presentation. So
that was from one agency leader that I think said that.
Okay, well, our purpose is not to be gloomy. We don't want to attract the title of Dr. Doom. So we're really trying to look and say, well, what kind of positive looks forward do we need in order to make further progress in the next decade of putting together better scientific understanding of the Delta? And so please take all our remarks in that spirit. So one of the critical events, or a bunch of critical events that really helped move the science forward over the last decade is the development of new tools for science. And I don't think I can emphasize enough how important these new tools are to helping us advance our understanding of events in the Delta or anywhere for that matter. And so we've listed 6 here. These were the 6 that we thought were the most prominent in the SBDS 2016 work, but there are others, and if you have a chance to go through the other papers, you'll see that this is a subset of all of the new tools that the scientific community were able to bring to bear on the problems of the Delta. I'll just speak briefly about these. The first one is near and dear to my heart because I've spent a lot of my career working on Pacific salmon, and this is the development of miniaturized acoustic tags that are small enough to put in salmon smolts migrating through the Delta. And these little tags are about as long as a little fingernail and about 1/8 of an inch in diameter. And they send out an acoustic ping that is digitally coded, so each one is an individual name tag for the fish it's in. And if you put then detectors in the water, you can follow the fish moving down through the channels of the Delta. And I think everybody has heard many times, we know that, say, smolts that migrate down the Sacramento River channel survive better than those that go through Georgiana Slough into the center Delta. And now with these tags, we can actually monitor the detailed movement patterns of the fish and often find out where they meet their demise if they're eaten by a predator or otherwise killed in the Delta. So we can now say with much more specificity where the fish go and where they're likely to encounter predators. That increases our capacity for making management decisions quite a bit. And I noticed in one of the posters that they're now looking at ways to fit tags of this sort into Delta smelt. Hopefully not too late. But again, if they could tag these fish in such a way that you can monitor them acoustically, then we might actually find out something about where Delta smelt go other than the sort of very generalized information that comes from the midwater trawls. Another big advance in measurement in the Delta, these tools have been around for a while, but they're only just being implemented in the Delta, is remote sensors that will monitor water quality variables. And so you can measure variations in a number of water quality aspects. In a particular case, it's nitrogen compounds that they're monitoring in the water of the Delta, so that instead of going out with a water sampler and taking a sample of water daily or weekly or monthly and then analyzing it, you get actual continuous information on the concentrations of nitrate in the water, which is particularly useful for monitoring pulses of nutrients moving through the Delta, detecting when there are big increases or decreases in nutrient levels. And this can be done for a number of water quality parameters and gives us much better information on the extremes of nutrient loading and also the average levels of nutrients in the Delta that often could not be captured by these sort of infrequent water sampling processes. Also advances in two-dimensional and three-dimensional modeling. So I'll just explain those a little bit. The sort of stalwart for monitoring water movements in the Delta has been what they call a one-dimensional model, and those models assume that the pattern of water flow is the same vertically, horizontally, and along channel. Two-dimensional models allow you to distinguish along channel and either vertical or horizontal variations in flow patterns, and three-dimensional models allow you to distinguish flow patterns vertically, horizontally, and along channel. The computational requirements for those higher dimensional models were so large in the past that it really wasn't much point in trying to build them, but now we have much improved modeling technology, and so it's really feasible to build these very high dimensional models for the whole of San Francisco Bay, the Delta, and even upstream if you have questions that require that level of differentiation. One of the really exciting things that's come out of this higher level of modeling is to be able to describe in detail the patterns of flow at channel junctions in the delta and say, well, if we've got acoustically tagged fish coming down this channel, we can now describe the patterns of water flow in detail at that junction and understand how the flow of water may be influencing the pathways that the fish take when they come to a choice point in the delta. And we can also get much better information on how water quality issues are distributed in the delta. For example, how salinity moves through the delta than we could with just the one-dimensional model. So lots of improvement in our understanding of the patterns of water movement in the delta arising from the development of such models. Again, we were talking quite a bit about levees just a little while ago, and one of the issues about levees in the delta is they were put together over a long period of time, and there's not much information on the structure of those levees inside. I mean, you can look at the outside and see what it looks like, but the vulnerability and the fragility of the levees is very much determined by what's inside the levee. Boreholes have been the sort of standard technique for assessing internal structure, but that's a very time-consuming process to get that kind of information. Well, we now have some remote sensing techniques that will help us examine the interior structure of the levee without actually having to dig a hole in it. And also, we can use satellite imagery to monitor very small changes in the shape and the subsidence of levees. So we can get very quickly a good, much better overview picture of how the levee system is changing and how its vulnerability may be changing. So this is particularly useful for trying to answer the kinds of questions you were asking about, which levees are the ones that are more vulnerable for failure in the future. And again, these remote sensing tools are pretty new. We still have a lot of work to do to make them work very much to our advantage in the Delta, but we're positioned with a much stronger set of scientific tools to go out and develop the kind of information we need for making decisions about managing levees. We're also very much concerned about the implications of climate change for the Delta, and there's been big advances in the global climate modeling, but those models still only provide a limited number of grid points within the whole of California, to say nothing of the Delta. And Mike's been very much involved in techniques for what we call downscaling those very widely distributed points from the global climate models into a description of local weather patterns that is the information we need for talking about how flow regimes in the rivers are going to change and how that's going to play out in terms of water supply and flood risk and so on. So if you have questions about that, you have the absolute expert here to answer them for you. But those downscaling techniques have really been critical to gaining an understanding of how global climate change is going to play out locally and the influences it's going to have on water supply and ecosystem in the Delta. And finally, new analytic tools, particularly with respect to how we assess the potential toxicity of Delta waters, the Delta organisms. As has been said, the Delta is this tremendous cocktail of chemicals that come from agricultural, urban, and industrial runoff. And we've had very limited tools for understanding and being able to pick apart that mixture and look at its potential impacts on aquatic organisms. I mean, we knew that there were times when Delta waters were acutely toxic to invertebrates and sometimes to fish, but it was this big mixture of stuff, and so it was hard to say what the real culprits might be. And there are also lots of potentially sublethal effects of these chemicals on aquatic organisms that may influence their ability to survive in the long term. Well, we now have also new analytic tools for being able to not only measure the toxicity of these substances to test organisms, but also be able to understand exactly what is in the mixture and what its likely, the likely principal causes of any toxic effects are. So again, changes in analytic tools that have really advanced our ability to understand this complex cocktail of chemicals in the delta and its potential impacts on the ecosystem, but also feeding through into potential public health problems. So big advances there, and if we can get a proper monitoring program for water quality in the delta, then I think we'll be in a much better position with, say, these two-dimensional and three-dimensional models to really understand the way substances are moving through the delta and how they might be impacting on the ecosystem or getting into the water supply. In the sort of glossy summary for policymakers that you have is really a summarization of a longer article that will appear in the December issue of San Francisco Estuary and Watershed Sciences. So here we're kind of talking about a summary of a summary, and there's a lot more description in that longer article, which we tried to write in a way that was accessible to people such as you. So we hope you'll find that of use when it comes out. Unfortunately, because of the requirements of the scientific publishing system, we couldn't give you a preprint of that article, but we have depended on this shorter summary. And the longer article sort of focuses on what we thought were important policy implications of the technical papers in the 2016 SPDS. We didn't actually have a section on forward-looking or forward-thinking actions in that longer paper, but we have sort of extracted these from the section on policy implications in that longer paper. And again, in the interest of time, I'll go fairly quickly through these. I think one of the key things, key points we want to make was that we would like the scientific community and the policy community to start thinking more long-term. You know, looking 50 years or so into the future was part of the Delta visioning exercise, but our sense is that following that exercise, we sort of came back down to thinking about what's going to happen in the next year or two and not really paying enough attention to how a lot of the things we do now and external forces are going to play out over the longer time period. And it's our view that that kind of long-term thinking is going to be really important for developing appropriate policies in the here and now. So we're encouraging the scientific community and the policy community to spend a bit more of their limited energy on looking further forward. And that will mean incorporating more exploratory and forward-looking science into the whole science enterprise. So this can work into the science action planning process, but it also requires a deliberate decision that we're going to allocate some of the limited resources we have for science and for policy, for that matter, into this longer-term enterprise. So we hope you will think about that. One of the reasons we think this is potentially problematic is that the science career paths, particularly in the state government, are pretty narrowly constrained. And when I was here as lead scientist, one of the things we worked on and weren't successful at resolving was the problem that in the state agencies, if you're going to advance your career, you have to get out of science and into administration. So we were proposing then, and I think it's still worth looking at, that the state agencies have a science career path so that you can get good people and keep them in science, and they can develop this broader, longer-term perspective and maybe be given a bit of freedom to think beyond the immediate policy crisis into things that will be happening a few years down the road. One of the things we think is going to be key as the external forces on the Delta continue to impact what goes on, and also as climate change unfolds, is that extreme events are going to start driving policy decisions. So we tend to present climate change as, gradual increase in temperature or some gradual changes in sea level. But as Brian Atwater was saying, the things you've got to worry about are we have an El Nino and an onshore storm that piles water up on the coast, and then there's a big flood coming down the mountains, and bingo, those are the things that are really going to cause dramatic change in the Delta. And so we feel it's important to start thinking about how do we structure our science and policy to deal with that kind of infrequent but extreme event. Maybe not the 10,000-year event, it's kind of hard to plan for that, but certainly the 10 or 15-year event you can incorporate into your thinking. One of the sorry?
Just a heads up, your colleague has a panel at 12:15, I think. So, not. Oh, okay. Okay. I'm just doing a time check.
Okay, thank you. One of the heresies in our summary document is the suggestion that you should start looking positively at some of the invasive species issues in the Delta. The whole notion of alien invasive species is taken on a hugely negative connotation. But the fact is, we're already benefiting from some of the invaders. Striped bass were brought here to provide a recreational and potentially a commercial resource. Lots of people like striped bass in the Delta. Similarly, the largemouth bass fishery in the Delta has become one of the premier largemouth bass fisheries in the United States. And there are, with the changing structure of the Delta and the changing climate, there are probably parts of the Delta that may never be made suitable for native species, and so it's maybe time to start asking, how can we gain positive benefit from these places that we won't be trying to restore for native species, and they may have real positive benefit taking advantage of some of the alien species that are available here. So just something that we think the science community and the policy community needs to start thinking about. Although I'm sure there's going to be a lot of pushback. The third to the last point is another one which I think is going to be considered heretical, and that is we think it's time to start thinking about alternatives to conservation in place. All of our native species conservation is focused on improving habitat or other conditions in the Delta to allow them to survive in the Delta, and we do need to continue doing that. But some of them are truly on the brink. Delta smelt is the obvious example. And so you have to ask, well, if we just continue to pursue the single focus of restoration in the Delta for Delta smelt, and it doesn't work, then Delta smelt are gone. There are alternatives in the literature. Some of them are very hotly debated, but we think it's appropriate to start developing the scientific foundation for implementing some of the alternatives if the policy discussion suggests that that's a thing to do. And you have to start doing that before the species goes extinct. So we think it's time for the Delta science community to start at least having a conversation about things like assisted relocation. Are there habitats elsewhere we can move some of these species to where they could survive? Either while we improve the Delta or as an alternative place to preserve the species. Two other ideas that are being developed in other locations are something called assisted evolution, helping species to develop the capacity to survive and even prosper in warmer waters. And the third, which is a kind of absolute fallback measure, is cryopreservation of the genetic information that's contained in those species so that you can hang on to it until, or if there is some time in the future when these species could be resurrected. The next to the last bullet is something that was discussed at the DPIC meeting, which we think is particularly valuable area to pay more attention to, and that's more development of models that will allow you to look longer term into the future. We have a lot of models that are employed in the Delta, but they're not, by and large, forecasting models of that sort. And the sort of thing that was in our minds when we wrote this was models of the ecosystem and the water supply that are more like the global climate models that allow you to project some decades into the future. If we take these kinds of management and policy initiatives now, how are they going to play out in a changing climate and a world that's otherwise changing? And we think that that kind of ability to explore alternative futures and develop future scenarios would allow you to develop a clearer picture of where we might be going, where we would like to go, and what we can do now to help follow a path that we would feel was desirable in the future. And the last one is another thing that came up at as a result of the science enterprise workshop, including more social science in the overall Delta science endeavor. One of the things that came clear to us from the 2016 State of Bay Delta Science was that although many of the scientists were doing things that impacted on Delta's place, nobody was really thinking about Delta's place in the design or the interpretation of their information. So, as was suggested in the science enterprise, getting more social sciences involved in the whole enterprise would probably be beneficial all around. Okay, and I talked way longer than I thought I was going to, so I'm going to quit. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to just turn it back a couple of slides and just close this up with a little nod back to the Delta Science Strategy. And by the way, I wanted to say it's been an honor working with the editorial board, including Dick Norgard, who couldn't be here today. It's a little bit sad for me this is our last little moment here. So going back to the science strategy, there's a quote in the Delta Science Plan, and it's that communication is the keystone for transforming information into knowledge. And I think the Science Action Agenda is really an opportunity to transform knowledge into action. So I know we will be working on pulling out areas of actionable science to include in the Science Action Agenda. And many of the issues in these papers also warrant further discussion like we had at the panel yesterday. I thought that was an opportunity that was great to get some policymakers and have some candid discussion. So hopefully we could do more of that in the future. And so as we're closing this chapter, and we're not quite done with this chapter of State of Bay Delta Science 2016, I think we have an epilogue, but really just wanted to say that it's just turning a page on our shared vision for science, which is also known as One Delta, One Science. So with that, I'm sure the mics would like to answer your questions.
Darcy, thank you. Mary?
Just a couple quick comments, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the presentation. I was in attendance on Monday and saw and heard it, and one thing that popped up to me on the slide, I don't know, Bob, if you can pull it up, the slide, or one of you with all the colors, the atmospheric river, what we learned since 2008, and I wrote down a quote, but my notes don't attribute it to anyone, but in regards to number one, nutrients are important. My quote is that low turbidity drives up growth of invasive species, Microcystis, Anagarya densa, and probably other invasive species, aquatic weeds. And we've talked about those issues here within the council and working to try to address them. So as we try to address them, we need to recognize what the roots are, and just to highlight that low turbidity came up as one of those roots in addition to the aquatic food webs and their lack of sustenance for native species, et cetera. I think it's interesting. I think Mike on the right said to us, Mike on the right, science isn't there yet on how to fix some of these issues through 1 through 7. And all we do is refer to science, talk about science, try to gather the science, try to talk about, collaborate the science, and yet there's still so much that's missing, and it's hard to imagine. We have one of the greatest analyzed resources of the state, maybe the nation, the Delta, and there still isn't enough science there to answer all the questions and problems that we have. And I don't want to misstate your point, but And we've said it here even earlier today, there's still so much that's missing, particularly to delta levees in the earlier presentation. And it's amazing to me because there are so many scientists that are putting good work into these complex problems of the delta from an environmental and perspective as well as multiple. Expanding the science career paths, I think, is an extremely important element of this report, something for all of us to think about. And then in regards to the forward-thinking action slide, Mr. Chairman, my last comment, the last bullet refers to including Delta as an evolving place. My way to respond to that is, what's our plan B? What's our plan B for vanishing species? What's our plan B to address invasive aquatic weeds? What can we do if what we're doing now isn't working? But how do we develop that plan B? And how do we start promoting it? Because obviously the plan A isn't working. Thank you.
Just to comment on your last point, and the alternatives to conservation in place, we think, is a kind of plan B, but the problem is that the scientific foundation for doing those things with most of the species in the delta is not available. And an important reason why it's not available is nobody thought it was important to do that. Yeah. So the first step is to alert people that this is an important thing to be paying attention to, and if we develop some interest and generate some resources, then the information will start to come.
And Mr. Chairman, to my colleagues, the Delta on Fast Forward that we have before us, the executive summary, I think, is really conclusive. It's very brief. This report itself is very brief for us to look through. But in the last paragraph, it reads, in the future, water managers will have to adjust to reduced and more variable inflows to the Delta and to less predictable sources of water supply. And again, with everything that we're doing, it's one more thing we need to take into consideration. Thank you.
In terms of your first point about, we've done all this science and yet the science still isn't there, I'm not sure that everyone would agree with me. But I would just note that, I think that we made a lot of progress on many of the individual problems. We're in much better position as a community to sort of say, well, this is a change that needs to happen. What we're running up against, always, it's that sort of inevitability that I mentioned, is this the interconnection between the problems is that, every time we tell you, oh, if you change, the Sacramento treatment plant or something, certain things will happen. We're in a position that actually, though, that's part of the problem, and it's connected to other parts of the system, and so it's very difficult to home in and say
it's an evolving place.
Yeah,
Delta is an evolving place.
I'll take advantage of the moment to just say in the sort of looks forward that Michael was talking about, he mentioned the business of the modeling, and the thing that came out of the science enterprise workshop, one of the key recommendations so far is a focus on this sort of integrated cross-cutting modeling where you really have not just your standard hydrodynamic model, but ecosystem and humans in there and everything else. And to my mind, that's the only way we're going to make much progress on the fact that we can find these very precise recommendations, but they can't be precise because everything's interconnected, and that's our best way of juggling that.
All right, Darcy, thank you for organizing the panel. Mike, thank you for serving as editors again and for briefing us on the report. Our regards and thanks to Dick Norgard. Please pass those along. Do we have any requests for comments? All right. That concludes file item number 10. File item number 11, do we have anybody that wishes to comment on anything? Very good. None. That leads us to thank you for coming. This meeting is adjourned. For those of you that are going to partake of the conference lunch, it's served downstairs.